Hi, I'm John Brazner, a biologist with the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, and I'm going to be giving you an update today on what's happening with the ecosystem monitoring pilot project we've been working on. Lots of co-authors on this project. Couldn't have done it without them. Francis McKinnon, Sean Basquel, Tara Crew, Robin Collin, Chelsea Sheehy, Maureen Cameron McMillan, Elizabeth Walsh, and Shavonne Meyer, all people either working for Department of Natural Resources or have been at one time. So you may remember that the Biodiversity Act was passed in March of 2021 after much public debate, and it was called Bill 4, an act to provide for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in Nova Scotia. The main thrust of that legislation was to provide for the stewardship, conservation, sustainable use, and governance of biodiversity in the province as part of an integrated framework of legislation. But what brings us into it, and the reason why we're taking on this ecosystem monitoring pilot project, is because part of the language in the bill was to assess, saying government needs to assess the state of biodiversity in the province and to provide information to inform the responsible conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. We're going to be taking an ecosystem by ecosystem approach here is the way we're looking at our approach to state of biodiversity reporting in Nova Scotia. And a lot of these are going to look familiar here. We're starting out with forested wetlands, but these other key ecosystems of interest pretty much are the same as those that have been identified in the Guestboy Conservation Group's efforts as target ecosystems. So tidal marshes, freshwater wetlands, forests, bogs and barrens, beaches and dunes, coastal islands. We certainly believe lakes and rivers need to get done, but they are not, neither lakes or rivers are ecosystems that we really have jurisdiction over in government. That's other departments' work. And so someone else is going to clearly need to take this on. And none of these, I mean, to do this on a provincial scale, much less, right now we're in Gaspowick and we're talking about Gaspowick work, but to do this province-wide is going to take an army of people. We certainly discovered that this year. It was very difficult to do what we did with just a few of us working on it. So there going to need to be cooperation among various groups, citizen scientists, NGOs, other government agencies, academia, as many people as we can if we're going to get this done on any regular basis. And so, yeah, we need to, I would be very interested in talking with people at the meeting who are interested in pursuing any of these, or anyone who happens to be listening to this recording. Please get in touch. The focus of our current ecosystem monitoring pilot is forested wetlands, as I mentioned. And specifically, we decided we couldn't look at all types. We couldn't look necessarily at wooded peatlands and treed swamps and shrub swamps and all sorts of ecosystems that fit into that model. So we have decided to look at treed swamps as an indicator ecosystem for forested wetlands. And our plan is to use birds and amphibians to assess the biodiversity condition at these sites. There's obviously a lot of ways you could go, a lot of things you could measure. The more people we have involved, the more we can get out of this. But we felt like we had the capacity to do was monitor birds and amphibians using automated recording units spread across the province as far and wide as we could. And it looks like we'll have about 100 sites instrumented and recordings produced after next year. We've got quite a few already in the bag here, but we plan to try to repeat those surveys every 5 years or so, if possible, so that we can assess trends over time. As it turns out, we bit off a pretty difficult ecosystem type to start with. Many of you are probably aware that the distribution of forested wetlands is not very well mapped across the province. There's a lot of inaccuracies in what we show, a lot of errors due to omission of sites. So it was a tricky thing to do, but we wanted to start with them because we had been doing a fair bit of work on these types of ecosystems over the last 7 or 8 years, and thought we could use a predictive ecosystem mapping model that one of our co-authors, Sean Basquel and several others within our department have been working on. And we wanted to spread those sites across some sort of ecologically meaningful unit, but felt that eco-districts and ecoregions were just, there were too many of them to spread just 100 recording units across and still have a decent sample size. So I can talk more about this in detail with anybody who's interested, but we used an ordination approach using a bunch of bioclimatic variables that Rob and Colin had put together, things like the Enhanced Vegetation Index, the Heat Load Index, the Topographic Wetness Index, Continentality, some really interesting bioclimatic variables, and then plug that into a non-metric multidimensional scaling. Boom, magic happened, and we had 5 different, we're calling them eco groups, that group the eco districts into similar bioclimatic characteristics. And so we had the Cape Breton Highlands as that group up in the upper right of the middle figure on the right-hand side of the slide. That's Cape Breton Highlands. They're very different than everything else. Then we had a low elevation group kind of in the valley and up near Truro and even a little bit of the lowlands of Cape Breton. We had a high elevation group like through the Cobequids, and we had Atlantic coastal sites, and then interior eastern and western Nova Scotia as one group. So there were actually 5 nice groupings, and as it turned out in the field, really there were very few of the treed swamps that we were looking for in the highlands or in the high elevation sites like the Cobequids. So we ended up, we're working with just 3 major regions for distributing our sites, and I'll show you maps of those in just a second. So the first thing that we did is we looked at where the PEM, this predictive ecosystem mapping model, identified where treed swamps were located. And there were 6 or 8 different types of treed swamps that are identified through the PEM, but we decided to focus on red maple-conifer swamps. So red maple and any combination of black spruce, red spruce, balsam fir, because those we knew that they're quite biodiverse and they're also widespread across the province, at least the PEM predicts that they are. So they seem like a good place to start. Now, because we were interested in the end here, we're wanting to develop some sort of indicators of ecosystem condition or indexes of ecological integrity for our focal ecosystems. We wanted to spread our sites across a gradient of human disturbance. And so we characterized human disturbance as the percent developed kind of urban commercial lands, percent agriculture, percent recent forest harvesting, and percent roads in a 1 kilometer square grids that we plastered over the province. As it turned out, this didn't work very well, but we are characterizing the 1,000-meter buffers around the boundaries of our sites to get a final characterization of human disturbance. But that's where we started, and our hope was to be able to select 1/3 of our sites from low, medium, and high disturbance categories. As I said, it didn't work out very well, but in the end, our characterization of the 1,000-meter buffers suggests that it's the distribution we have should be okay. Starting with 100 automated recording units, but we had 100 sites that we were going to work with, and we wanted to weight the number that we put in each of our 3 bioclimatic regions or eco groups, that is the low elevation, the Atlantic coastal, and the interior sites, by the area that was in each of those, the total area that was in each of those. And we also wanted them to have the correct tree composition. They needed to be red maple conifer swamps. We wanted to have them be relatively large so that from any point reaching out from our automated recording unit, we would have at least 75 meters of swamp on all sides of that recording unit, because those recording units are recording things that go beyond even 75 meters, but in many cases, not much beyond that. So we're trying to maximize the number of birds that we're hearing with our ARUs that are actually in the ecosystem habitat of interest. And we also wanted them to be reasonably accessible on foot or by boat. Most of them are a kilometer or so from a road access point, and most of them are even, I think the furthest was 1.5 kilometers, and most of them are less than 500 meters. And that is on the right there is just a sample of a site, a wetland in the middle with a 1,000-meter buffer around it. And I am going to be talking about 1,000 meters buffers here in just a second. This is a map of where our actual final site locations ended up. We have the red sites, the red dots in the green part of the landscape. Those are our low elevation sites, and the blue dots along the Atlantic coast there, those are the Atlantic coastal sites. And so, as I said, there were very few of these types of swamps in the highlands or high elevation groups, so we're going to need some other kind of ecosystem characterization to provide an indication of what's going on up in those. Bogs may be a good one for the Cape Breton Highlands. Anyway, we did field reconnaissance at a whole bunch of sites there in just the kind of mid-May or mid-April to the end of May, and ended up deploying ARUs at 61 of those sites. Not all of them which were ideal locations, and in the end we've pared them down to 35 low elevation sites and 16 Atlantic coastal sites, and we're going to be deploying at approximately 50 interior sites next year. This just gives you a sense of visually of how different the low elevation swamps were from Atlantic coastal swamps. I'm not sure you can see anything that's that stands out particularly strongly just by looking at this, but this at least gives you a sense of the kind of places that we were working with. I'll give you in the next slide, I'm going to be talking about some limited habitat characterization that we've done. So we'll see if there are some differences. This is a visual, gives you a visual sense. These data are just in, fresh off the press. We really haven't had a chance to get to much of the data analysis yet, but I want to do a quick plot of some sort to give you a sense of how big any of the habitat differences, some of the main habitat differences are at these sites. So a quick dot plot giving you with standard errors around the means of 6 different variables. The two on the lower right, cinnamon fern cover and basal area, looks like really no difference between those two. I haven't done statistics on this. We're going to have a lot more data coming in, so we'll do that a bit later. But sphagnum cover does look to be at least marginally different, marginally higher at the Atlantic coastal sites. Canopy cover in the upper left, a little bit higher maybe in the low elevation sites. But the two habitat characteristics with the biggest differences are that the percent deciduous cover in the canopy of that canopy cover is, there's more red maple basically in the low elevation sites, upwards of 40% of that, whatever the total cover was, and then 20% or so for AC sites. So essentially double, LE is double what the AC sites were. And then percent tall shrub cover, also about double in the low elevation sites relative to AC sites. So a bit messier, scrubbier habitats in towards the ground in these LE sites relative to AC sites. And that's all we really have in terms of habitat characteristics. I wish I had tree height, but we just didn't have that ready yet. And so maybe some differences, but not as different as I thought they might be. And we'll see how that plays out in terms of what the bird communities are. As I said, we've been out doing field work later in the summer and early fall to find sites for next year. We instrumented 51 sites in LE and AC bioclimatic regions, and we're looking for 50 more or so in the interior, the gray part of that. Well, those purple dots are the sites that we've verified already through field reconnaissance this summer that will work. Those are 41 sites. We're looking for 8 or 10 more further east, kind of in the Guysborough and Antigonish area. Not sure what Fiona, how difficult Fiona is going to have made getting around up there, but we'll see what we see come spring. And then if you put those two things together, get a sense of kind of what the whole overall spread of our sites across the province would look like, assuming we have a few more there in the east. But it gives us a pretty good spread across the province. As I said, we don't have a whole lot of data yet, but I did have a chance, thanks to Francis McKinnon and Chelsea Sheehy, I was able to analyze some of the data for the 1,000-meter buffer, human disturbance in that buffer. And so we've got low elevation sites on the right, Atlantic coastal sites on the left. And you can see that the range for the low elevation sites is really wide. It ranged from 1 to 86% human disturbance, and much less 7 to 39% in the Atlantic coastal region, but that still gives us a pretty good range to work with. So we're fairly happy about the distribution of sites across the human disturbance gradient, even though our first effort at doing that with 1 kilometer square grid didn't really work out very well. Just one more quick look at the specific types of human disturbance that went into that last slide. So we're breaking apart total human disturbance into the different categories that we worked with. And one of the things that stands out is that agriculture is much more prevalent disturbance in the low elevation sites compared to AC sites, and development, urbanization, industrial development is much more prevalent in the Atlantic coastal sites. And recent harvesting tends to be equally prevalent elsewhere, 10 to 15% kind of across all of our sites. So how did it work out with the PEM and the wetland inventory? How useful did we find them? Well, unfortunately, neither of them did a very good job of identifying treed swamps. Only 28 of the 50 PEM predicted sites that we visited were actually what we expected. So 12 of them were total misses. They weren't wetlands, and 8 were not treed swamps. 33 of 52 wetland inventory sites were at least correctly identified to treed swamps. They're not specific to what the swamp type would be, so we can't assess that. But only 6 of those were not wetlands, and 13 were not swamps. In fact, all of those that weren't swamps were woody peatlands. But that's me actually screening them visually by looking at these sites overlaid on top of aerial imagery, and I intentionally excluded a huge number of them that I knew were wooded peatlands just from the imagery. So clearly from this exercise, we know wooded peatlands are underestimated because they're often characterized as treed swamps, and treed swamp estimates are just way off. So the bottom line is we have a very poor representation of where our treed swamps and peatlands are in Nova Scotia. So where are we, and what are we doing next? Well, as I said, we retrieved all our ARUs in mid-July and did habitat assessments at each of those sites, including soil samples at each. Fairly complex data sheet, so we've got lots of good information to work with from those sites. We also finalized most of our interior site locations that we'll be deploying ARUs at next year. We've got the recordings downloaded. Phil Taylor's begun analysis on those. We're not sure exactly how we're going to get all of our analysis completed, but that at least has begun. We'll be redeploying at interior sites in the spring of 2023. And then we're also thinking of what our next focal ecosystem will be, and leaning towards salt marshes and floodplain swamps because, well, for a number of reasons I won't get into here, but I'd be interested in talking with any of you who are either working on those sorts of things or would be interested in helping out. And then ultimately we'll need to develop monitoring plans for the new focal ecosystems. Not much really to say about this, except that these are floodplain sites that we identified this year and ones that we could work with as if we're going to include those as our next focal ecosystem. You can see they are nicely spread across all of Gaspoick, and so that jives nicely with what we're working on here and talking about today. So what are we going to do with all this? Well, I mean, the ultimate goal is to document baseline biodiversity conditions across the province, and in this case, for treat swamps. And then ultimately, we're going to have to report on the state of biodiversity to meet our Biodiversity Act requirements. And what are we going to do? Well, we're still thinking about all that. Don't pay too much attention to that little inset figure on the right, but it's kind of showing it. You can look at these things at different scales, and we're thinking about things like indices of ecosystem integrity, trying to identify particular indicator species or guilds. There may be habitat indicators. And I think definitely we'll need to be looking at changes in landscape character among in the 1,000-meter buffers over time, because I think that's likely to be one of the areas that is changing the most. And then, as we resample these things, we can examine trends over time, so that we can talk about, whether things are getting better, staying the same, or getting worse. That's kind of the simple explanation for where we're headed. So I just want to thank all our partners. Lots of help from various co-authors, but Phil Taylor there on the left from Acadia University, and Ian Manning on the right helped us out by loaning us some ARUs when our order just took forever to come from Germany. And Chelsea Sheehy is on the right of Ian. She was co-author on this, but also a student intern in May, June. And they're both from the Nova Scotia Community College campus in Lunenberg. And then a good friend of mine out of the blue came up with Swamp Walking 2022 t-shirts. That's Pam Garkey, and really appreciate having those around. Really does feel like you're at the end of the road just about every time you stop the truck to get out for a site. So it's an appropriate t-shirt. And just one more reminder, we'd love to work with anybody who has an interest in this. We're going to need lots of bodies out there, and would be very interested in talking with you if you think you could help out somehow. So thanks very much.